250 miles per hour, 300 feet off the ground, loaded to the max with bombs, fuel, and extra ammunition. On top of all that, the enemy already knows you are coming and is far more prepared than you and your crew could have ever imagined. This was the reality for 178 B-24 bombers on the morning of August 1st of 1943. What would follow would go down as one of the most disastrous and costly missions in American history. A mission so unmatched in its heroism that 5 young airmen would be awarded the Medal of Honor for their acts in this mission. More than were given out on any other single military operation, including D-Day. This is the story of Operation Tidal Wave. In June of 1942, 1 year earlier, 13 B-24s took off from an airfield in Libya. In the grand scheme of things, this was a very small raid, but it would play a major role in this story. These 13 liberators were taking off to bomb a city by the name of Ploesti. The Nazi war machine in 1942 and 43 was operating at maximum capacity, with large armies pushing outward in nearly every direction with hundreds of thousands of military vehicles and weapons powering their aggression. But these military vehicles and weapons desperately needed one thing to keep them running: oil. And unfortunately for Germany, this was a resource that they never truly had enough of. Romania was one of the top oil producers in the world, and the center of their operations was a city by the name of Ploesti.
Ploesti. Ploesti. The name still makes us nervous. That's the kind of a target it was. From our bases in southern Italy, across the Adriatic, over the Yugoslav mountains, to the valley of the Blue Danube, and high over the Romanian plain to Ploesti. A target we came to know better than our own hometown. 600 miles one way across hostile territory to Hitler's oil barrel, to Ploesti. 19 square miles of oil refineries, tank farms, marshalling yards, boiler houses, pipelines, and cracking plants. Processing more than 700,000 tons of crude oil a month. 1/3 of all the oil feeding the Nazi war machine. And that meant lubricating oil, gun oil, gasoline, kerosene, diesel oil, paraffin, machine grease, aviation gasoline. The Nazis could make synthetic fuels, but lubricating oil has to come from natural petroleum. And one of the richest sources of natural petroleum was at Ploesti.
Because of the importance of Ploesti, a raid would first be planned in June of 1942. This raid saw just over a dozen American bombers take off, and in the normal bombing style, hit the city of Ploesti. There was minimal defensive flak or fighter cover, and the overall mission was considered a success. Because of the small size of the raid, the damage done was minimal, but it showed that the Romanian city could be hit, and with minimal cost. The following year, it was decided that Ploesti needed to be hit again, and this time in a large-scale raid to hopefully do substantial damage and put as much production as possible out of commission. So, a man by the name of Colonel Jacob Smart began to put together a plan.
Operating in the Middle East, the 9th United States Air Force, commanded by Major General Lewis Brereton, prepares for one of the most daring raids of the war. A daylight bombing of the Ploesti oil fields in Nazi-controlled Romania. Fields that supply the Nazi war machine with nearly 1/3 of its vital petroleum. Now, from bases in North Africa, 1,200 miles away, American bombers are ready to strike.
This plan would be based largely on the results of this first raid on Ploesti, which on some level made sense. The first raid had been fairly straightforward, and most importantly, defenses had been light, specifically the anti-aircraft. For this reason, the attack was planned in a different manner than most bombing raids of this time. To seriously damage the oil facilities at Ploesti, American bombers needed to hit their targets with high accuracy. And since flak and anti-aircraft artillery had previously been light, the best option was decided to be a low-level attack, executed during the day.
Once assembled, the Special Strike Force on the Libyan desert began 30 days of intensive training for what they hoped would be a devastating surprise attack. The plan was to approach the heavily defended target area at extremely low altitude to avoid detection for as long as possible.
They started to tell us where we were going to go about the middle of July of 1943. And at that time, they said we're going to make a raid, and it's going to be a long one. And he said instead of flying at 25,000 or 22,000 or 27,000 or 28,000, we're going to fly at low level. So one guy raised his hands and he said, "How low?" They said, "You can fly as low as you want to, but don't hit the camels because we don't know where to get them." See? But one guy did actually, apparently got too close to a camel.
This would allow for the most accuracy with bombing and would also hopefully keep them underneath German radar and undetected as they approached the city, since fighters were to be seen as the greatest threat. However, this could not have been farther from the truth. After the Ploesti raid in June of 1942, the Americans were not the only ones who learned from the attack. The Germans, recognizing how important the city's oil factories were to their war effort, immediately began fortifying Ploesti. Over the course of the next year, Ploesti was armed with one of the most advanced air defense systems in all of Europe. It included a vast arsenal of lethal 88mm guns, medium anti-aircraft cannons, and countless machine gun emplacements, many of which would be hidden in trains, fake buildings, or even stacks of hay, and all of which boasted well-trained and experienced crews. Furthermore, Germany and Romania had also installed barrages of defensive balloons with thick cables tying them to the ground. These were difficult to see at nearly 300 miles per hour and could easily destroy any plane that was unfortunate enough to run into one. By the time all of this was installed, Ploesti was the most heavily defended city outside of the Reich, a well-guarded and organized fortress. But the Allies knew none of this, and would pay a heavy price for their miscalculation. But nonetheless, in July of 1943, preparations began and training started.
Months of planning are behind the attack. For weeks, crews have studied their target, made practice runs perfecting the precision of the bombardiers.
In a rehearsal of the raid, with full bomb loads, the strike force passed over a simulated target area in the desert in approximately 2 minutes.
This training was a success. It allowed their crews to prepare for this new style of flying and proved that it was a viable plan. And while this training mission is underway here, let me introduce you to the bombers that we will be following during this incredible attack. Nightmare, flown by Lieutenant Colonel Julian Blyer. Brewery Wagon, flown by Lieutenant John Palm. The Vulgar Virgin, flown by Lieutenant Wallace Taylor. Euroclide in the Storm, flown by First Lieutenant Enoch Porter. Hell's Winch, flown by Colonel Addison Baker. Jose Carioca, flown by First Lieutenant Nicholas Stampolis. The Squaw, flown by Lieutenant Royden Lebrecq. Hail Columbia, flown by Colonel John Kane. Susie Q, flown by Colonel Leon Johnson. The Sandman, flown by Lieutenant Robert Sternfels. And Ole Kickapoo, flown by Second Lieutenant Lloyd Hughes. Every one of these planes would play a significant role in this mission, and every one would be filled with heroes, but they would all have drastically different fates. And you might be thinking, this looks like chaos. Some of the aircraft are olive drab and some are sand colors, and the insignias on the side are not even the same. And you'd be correct, but from my research, this is actually historically accurate. For this famous raid on Ploesti, American commanders actually had to pull together 5 different bomb groups to get the numbers they desired, which would be a total of 178 planes. Of these planes, 3 groups were from the newly formed Air Force in England, and 2 were from the 9th Air Force operating out of Libya, hence the different colored bombers. Furthermore, in 1943, the roundel of the United States aircraft had a wide variance, with 3 different insignias being used across different theaters, which are accurately shown on these planes. This lack of cohesiveness, and some might even say disorganization, was indicative of the United States Air Force during this early time in the war, as they were still trying to get things figured out. And unfortunately, it would also foreshadow some of the results of this famous mission. After training was completed and the crews were ready, the date was finalized, August 1st of 1943. In the blink of an eye, the eve of the attack was here.
As 0 hour approached, every man knew it would be a tough mission, 2,400 miles round trip. Ground crews labored throughout the night. The planes would have to carry extra fuel and extra ammo to fight off enemy aircraft, since there could be no Allied fighter protection. In addition, each aircraft carried 2 boxes of incendiaries to be dropped by hand in the target area. Dawn, August 1st, the great adventure began. Colonel Kane and Colonel Johnson each led one of the 5 main bomber groups into the air and out over the Mediterranean. Everything was proceeding on schedule as planned.
All was indeed going to plan for the first leg of the journey. The bombers were gaining altitude and forming up. So far, you've already seen here a great deal of fantastic footage from the actual planes, pilots, and crews of this famous raid. This footage was only made possible from the 9th Bomber Command camera unit. This group was made up of combat cameramen who were assigned to film and document the war with the 9th Air Force. And for the raid on Ploesti, between the 178 bombers that took off, there were actually 16 of these combat cameramen assigned to flights throughout the mission. One of them is on our first bomber, Nightmare. This cameraman would be Jerry Joswick, and his job was to record the raid on Ploesti. And record he would. Footage and photos that would become some of the most famous shots of the entire war. But we will get there shortly. As Nightmare and the other bombers continued across the sea to southern Europe, they were making good time. But then, out of nowhere, a B-24 by the name of Wongo Wongo suddenly began to fly erratically and unexpectedly crashed into the ocean. Although this was just one of more than 175 bombers, it would have massive implications on the attack, as the lead navigator for the entire mission was on board of the aircraft. The cause of this crash was never able to be accurately determined, and there were no survivors. Despite this, the mission had to continue, and the rest of the force carried on across the Mediterranean. Now, it is important to note here that this attack was designed specifically to be a surprise attack. This is one of the reasons that it was designed as a low-level strike, to remain under the radar and undetected. Another aspect of a surprise attack, however, was the requirement of radio silence. So, for the entirety of their journey to Ploesti, all B-24s were instructed to maintain strict radio silence to avoid alerting the Germans to their presence. Furthermore, as an organized surprise attack, it was crucial that all flights of the raid, which each had their own targets around the city, arrive at the same time, so that they could utilize the element of surprise, dropping their payloads before the enemy could react. But as we will see, these strategic decisions would create nothing but problems for the raiders. And these problems would start as soon as they reached southern Europe, in part due to the loss of the mission's lead navigator.
And then, the unforeseen happened while crossing the mountains of Yugoslavia. In dense clouds, the 5 bomber groups became separated. Those flying at higher levels picked up a tailwind and moved well ahead of the others.
As they crossed the mountains where they were supposed to begin the low flying, some of the flights began to get separated due to the cloud cover and varying engine settings. Due to the required radio silence, though, these problems were not able to be remedied, and as the target neared, the separation between groups only increased, leaving the trailing groups without the element of surprise. For perspective on just how out of position the groups were at this point, there was now a 20-minute gap between the two leading groups and the trailing three, when, according to the plan, there was only supposed to be a 1-minute difference between all 5 groups. Making matters worse, in reality, there was truly no surprise at all. The Germans were already totally aware of their presence and knew that the raiders were coming, so this silence was tragically in vain. Nonetheless, it continued and the groups remained separated as they approached their target. And if you can believe it, the mistakes were only just beginning. The two leading groups, the 376th Bomb Group and the 93rd Bomb Group, were led in a crucial misdirection. This occurred when the lead ship of the 376th, piloted by the commander of the entire 9th Air Force Bombing Command, made a navigational error, taking the two lead groups off course and away from their targets in Ploesti. Almost immediately, multiple ships in the two lead groups began to break radio silence to draw attention to the misstep, but nonetheless, they remained on the incorrect course. The first ship to break formation and head to the target was actually a lone B-24 of the 376th, Brewery Wagon, piloted by Lieutenant John Palm. Palm's navigator clearly knew that they were on the wrong path, and tried repeatedly communicating this to the lead ship, but they received no reply. Eventually, Palm made a bold decision. After carrying their payload so far to hit such a vital target, they were not going to miss their opportunity. So John Palm and Brewery Wagon broke formation and turned east to bomb Ploesti on their own. The lone B-24 quickly came upon heavy flak as they approached the area of their target. Their B-24 took multiple hits, 2 of which killed her bombardier as well as her navigator, who would ironically pay the ultimate price for his accurate navigation. As the seriously damaged B-24 carried on, John Palm was so desperate to get rid of their payload before they went down that he later said the following when he finally found an oil refinery. "By then, I didn't give a damn whose refinery it was. It was a refinery, and by God, I was going to drop the bombs come hell or high water." But unfortunately, a German Bf-109 was patrolling and saw the stricken Liberator. He dove in, raking the bomber with cannon fire and damaging it so much that it could not remain in the air. One of the rounds from this fighter seriously injured John Palm. The co-pilot took over and brought the plane down for a crash landing. Palm, the co-pilot, and 6 other crew members crawled out of the wreckage, which can be seen here. They were taken in as prisoners for the remainder of the war, and Brewery Wagon would be the first official bomber to be lost on the raid. Back with the two leading groups, the 376th Bomb Group's lead plane was still taking their flight, as well as the 93rd Bomb Group, in the wrong direction. And here they were beginning to take heavy ground fire as they went away from the target. It was obviously a very poor situation. And still, no one was able to get a reply from the lead ship. So someone had to step up. That someone would be the lead ship of the 93rd Bomb Group, Hell's Winch, flown by Lieutenant Colonel Addison Baker and his co-pilot, Major John Jerstad. They were 2 seasoned veterans who had already flown a full tour of duty in England. Recognizing their dilemma, Lieutenant Colonel Baker opted to break away from the 376th and lead his group, the 93rd, back towards their planned route. Now, the 2 leading bomb groups were also separated, but at least one of them was back on the original planned route. But it would not be an easy road. The 93rd was in deep trouble. They were now by themselves and had certainly made the enemy aware of their presence. They resumed their attack run and were shortly over the refineries around Ploesti. Many of the aircraft were not able to find their assigned targets, but at this point they were simply looking to hit any refinery they could find. As they approached and began to release their payload, Hell's Winch, the leading ship, took 2 direct hits from the intense flak. Their B-24 was hit badly, but could still fly. In order to maintain the lead position of the group, Baker jettisoned their bombs and attempted to take the 93rd onward in their attack, despite smoke and flames that were beginning to pour out of his aircraft. As they reached their target, one of the first bombers of the 93rd to go down was B-24 Euroclydon the Storm. As they were about to release their payload, she took a direct hit and both pilots were likely knocked out. From only around 300 feet or so, multiple crew members attempted to bail out, but they were far too low. Miraculously, 3 of the crew would somehow survive, bailing out from less than 400 feet, but just enough time for their chutes to partially deploy. One of these survivors, Jack Werner, was so badly injured that he was originally placed among the dead until someone realized that he was alive. All 3 would go on to become POWs. Around this time, German and Romanian fighters have been scrambled to intercept, and one Romanian fighter located a damaged B-24 and dove in. This ill-fated B-24 would be Jose Carioca. The Romanian fighter opened up and tore into the Liberator. Jose Carioca would immediately go down, tragically crashing into a women's prison near Ploesti, killing 100 and injuring another 200. As the 93rd continued to take a beating, their fearless leaders, Lieutenant Colonel Addison Baker and Major Jerry Jerstad in Hell's Winch, could no longer keep their bomber in the air. The flames were too much to bear, and Baker attempted to gain altitude so that all the crew could bail out. Unfortunately, in this effort, the ship rolled over and went down, crashing into the ground below. All of the crew members from the Liberator that led the 93rd to the correct path would be killed in action. Both the pilot, Lieutenant Colonel Addison Baker, and the co-pilot, Major Jerry Jerstad, would be awarded the Medal of Honor. These would be 2 of 5 more that would be given out on this mission. By now, to add more chaos to the situation, the 376th Bomb Group, the lead group that had made the critical navigation error, had adjusted and turned towards Ploesti. Their change in route had taken so long, however, that by now they were approaching from the south, the opposite direction of what was planned. And so, as the 93rd was finishing their run on the target, the 376 was starting theirs, with some planes just missing the incoming planes of the other bomb group. The remnants of the 93rd pulled out and headed for home. They had lost 11 of their own aircraft during the raid. Now it was the turn of the 376th. Due to the nature of their approach and the low-level attack, anti-aircraft positions placed on high hills and buildings actually found themselves firing down at the incoming bombers, and the gunners of the Liberators shooting upwards at ground targets.
Keene's men fired 2,400 rounds of ammunition in 90 seconds over the target, often firing upward at anti-aircraft units on tops of buildings.
Once they finally reached the refineries, the 376th, due to their mass confusion, ended up bombing targets of opportunity in the area rather than their specifically assigned objectives. After this, taking heavy losses themselves, they also turned and headed home. Around this time, the 3 remaining groups were now beginning to arrive. The first 2 to reach the target area would be the 98th Bomb Group, led by Colonel John Kane and his B-24 Hail Columbia, as well as the 44th Bomb Group, led by Colonel Leon Johnson and his Liberator, Susie Q. Also in the 98th, under Colonel John Kane, was B-24 Nightmare, carrying combat cameraman Jerry Jostwick. Jostwick was stationed in the waist of the bomber, right beside both gunners, so that he could look out of the window and capture the action. The following is his retelling of the raid from his book, Combat Cameraman. Nearing the great field of refineries, stretching some miles ahead, I saw 24 barrage balloons floating lazily among them. A few fires had started, and black oily smoke was forming a shroud. Then I could identify our first target by smokestack silhouettes. We were to hit the Phoenix Orion complex, and just beyond it, Astra Romana. My film gave out. Using daylight load, I quickly threaded another. The order came: incendiaries. These were for dozens of huge oil storage tanks and the small outbuildings which almost scraped our belly as we let go the fire sticks. Far to the left, I saw a bomber fly into the long cables that had held the two balloons captive. The first cable snapped as if cut by scissors. The second struck their engine. Instantly, the B-24 whipped around. It circled the cable, going down as if going down a corkscrew. A puffball of fire and smoke. The bomber was gone. There was ack-ack now, the familiar puffs in the air that flashed out colors. A jar told me that Nightmare had been hit, but I could not guess where. We roared into our run. But as they approached their targets, it was the worst possible scenario. To start with the other two groups just finishing their attack, all of the defenses were on high alert and fully armed. This made the anti-aircraft fire thick and deadly, and the sky was filled with enemy aircraft. However, there was now an even worse threat for the 98th, a German flak train. Robert Sternfels, who was in this group piloting B-24 Sandman just behind Kane's Hail Columbia, remembered this vividly.
So anyway, we were going around very slowly, and we got into trail, and there was a railroad track right next to us. It wasn't any further away than that wall over there. And on that railroad track was a train, a steam train, and I know it was steam because the smoke coming out of the stack was black, and it was laying right down on top of the cab. And when that occurs, you know damn well he's going fast. And well, behind that train were about 15 flat cars, and on the flat cars were guns. And so when we went, we were parallel with them, or they were parallel with us, at the same time that we made our turn, and I felt like we were ducks in a shooting gallery because they were shooting down. We lost 22 airplanes between the time we turned and the target. And we had 48 airplanes to start with.
As the 98th came in, the anti-aircraft locomotive opened up on the formation, but the machine guns of the B-24s responded. It was an incredible exchange between a locomotive speeding down the tracks and a flight of B-24s. After taking heavy losses, the 98th eventually did damage as well, killing multiple artillery crews and putting many of the positions out of action. Here we can see some of the footage Jerry Jostwick captured of this, with the machine guns of Nightmare clearly firing on the trains below. The train itself was so well placed and even driving the perfect direction and speed that it led some survivors to believe that it might have even been planned.
That train was in the right place at the right time to intercept us. Was that an accident? No way. We ran into an ambush, and that was all there was to it. Because as we went down this our route, we had haystacks on either side, and the top of the haystacks would open up, and here they exposed a bunch of guns. Well, they were waiting for us, and that's all there was to it.
To make matters worse, as they were now nearing the refineries, it became clear that the 93rd and 376th bomb groups, in their confusion, had actually hit the targets of the 98th. So, as they approached their assigned refineries, their targets were already burning below, causing additional problems. This included having to fly through the thick smoke, tall flames, and even some of the delayed action bombs still exploding as the 98th began their run. Jerry Jostwick in Nightmare recalls this as well.
Nightmare now flew through a dozen fires set by our own people in an earlier wave. Hadn't anyone foreseen how this would happen at 30 feet? Supposedly, delayed action bombs seemed to go off on contact. We were in our bombing run, but a blast tossed us way off, like a breeze throws a sheet of paper. I envisioned both of our pilots with all their strength hanging on to the controls. Storage tanks grew higher and hotter. We were headed straight for a 60-foot curtain of flame. I touched my goggles to make sure they were on, clamped the camera between my knees, clasped both hands under my armpits, and put my head down.
It was a terrible situation to be left with, but in one of the most valiant and courageous flights of the entire war, Colonel John Kane in Hale, Columbia, and Colonel Leon Johnson in Susie Q led their bomb groups directly into the smoke and flames that was burning their target. They had come this far and would not pull away now. Both the 98th and 44th Bomb Group came in at 300 feet and released their payloads as flak exploded all around them and machine gun fire tore into their bombers. Jerry Jostwick in B-24 Nightmare was close behind.
The cabin became an oven. The radio man yelled. Then we were through and out, relieved of 200 degrees of heat, but with all exposed hair gone and skin scorched. Bombs away. The first dose went down. Nightmare rushed towards the Romania complex. Meanwhile, it was plain our whole 5-group raid organization had fallen apart. Bombers were crisscrossing each other. It was a melee. Here, there, yonder, a B-24 was burning and crashing or being swallowed by curling billows of black, oily smoke.
One of these bombers, no doubt mentioned, would be B-24 Vulgar Virgin, flown by Captain Wallace Taylor. As Kane and the 98th stormed into their attack run, the Vulgar Virgin was in pursuit. As she entered, however, into one of the clouds of thick black smoke, she vanished and was not seen again. Taylor, however, would be the only survivor of bailing out at the low altitude. The rest of the crew from the Vulgar Virgin would be killed in action. In the next few moments, Nightmare, Hale, Columbia, and Susie Q would continue over their assigned refineries, with the rest of their groups close behind. In a scene that looked like a burning hell beneath them, they made it through. Many of the aircraft in these two groups would take the worst of it, seeing heavy losses and high casualties. Hale, Columbia, for example, was filled with bullet holes and barely in the air. As she limped back home, it was total chaos, with many bombers going in all directions and multiple flights scattered about. With substantial damage and only being able to fly at a reduced speed, some bombers were able to form up with other stragglers for a long flight home. Here they would have to simply hope and pray that they did not run into any patrolling fighters or unexpected ground fire. They would be wide open and vulnerable should that occur. But fortunately, they would have a guardian angel that arrived to protect them. This angel would be B-24 Squaw, piloted by Lieutenant Royden Lebrecq. Squaw, a fellow member of the 98th, had finished their raid towards the back of the group, but she had gotten lucky and only taken a small amount of damage. She was, in fact, able to fly back at full speed and get out of the dangerous countryside quickly, and was no doubt planning to do so, until her crew saw something. A group of shot up and struggling B-24s, desperately trying to limp back home. Although Squaw could have certainly maintained full speed and headed straight for Libya, she instead elected to slow down and accompany her crippled brothers. Lieutenant Lebrecq flew down to their level and joined their flight, flying cover for the crippled bombers and risking himself to give them a better chance of survival should they be attacked. Now, at almost this same time, the final bomber group was now arriving at the target, the 389th. They would be led by 2nd Lieutenant Lloyd Hughes and his bomber, Ole Kickapoo. Hughes was leading one of the groups in this final element to strike Ploesti. In addition to the anti-aircraft and fighters, the 389th would have to deal with, more so than any other flight, the effects of flying into their targets already smoking and on fire. These would impose unforeseen risks, and Lloyd Hughes and Ole Kickapoo would find this out firsthand. As they approached their assigned refineries, Ole Kickapoo took significant damage from flak and machine gun fire. In some of the hits, she began to leak aviation fuel profusely from her wings and belly. And now, with the target up ahead, Hughes saw what he was about to fly into, an inferno. Already being hit by other bombs, the refineries in front had already begun to burn intensely in some areas, with flames and smoke shooting to higher heights than even that of the approaching bombers. Here, Lloyd Hughes had a choice. He could turn away from the attack and pull off for safety, or he could continue the bombing run and ensure that his flight was led properly into their attack. He chose the latter. As Ole Kickapoo began her run, she released her bombs with accuracy onto their target. But as they were finishing the release of their payload, something appeared, a wall of flame and smoke, higher than their aircraft. Lloyd Hughes had no choice but to fly directly through it, and as she did, the leaking gasoline ignited, sending the entire wing into flames. Immediately, he tried to bring Ole Kickapoo down safely, and according to witnesses, he was making a beautiful approach, despite their intense damage and flames. But then, right as he was about to touch down, the wing gave out from the fire, and Lloyd Hughes and their crew crashed into the ground. In this crash, Hughes and 5 other crew members were killed. Miraculously, 4 survived and escaped the wreckage, but 2 would die within days from their burns. The other 2 were able to survive, but with severe wounds. Because of his courage and commitment to duty, 2nd Lieutenant Lloyd Hughes would also be awarded the Medal of Honor, posthumously.
Being one of the most heavily fortified areas in all Europe, the bombers fight their way home, knocking out 51 enemy planes. Although 21 bombers failed to return, the raiders struck the Nazi war machine a crippling blow. Home with battle scars, mission accomplished.
Only 21 losses of 178? Not that bad. But, spoiler alert, the newsreels did not disclose the accurate aftermath of the attack. Of the 178 planes that took off for the mission, a handful crashed or experienced engine problems, having to turn back before crossing the Mediterranean. Because of this, a total of 167 B-24s made it to their targets, and of these planes, only 88 would make it all the way back to land in Libya, just over 52%. One of these planes would be Susie Q, commanded by Medal of Honor recipient and commander of the 44th, Leon Johnson. Tragically, 15 days later, Susie Q would be shot down on another disastrous bombing raid to Italy, with her entire crew killed in action. Leon Johnson, however, was not on the bomber for this mission. Also making it back to Libya would be B-24 Nightmare, flown by Lieutenant Colonel Julian Blair, and carrying combat cameraman Jerry Jostwick. Because of his actions, we have an unbelievable amount of footage from the famous raid on Ploesti. Of the 16 cameramen that were assigned to this mission though, he would be the only survivor, and would later go on to write the book Combat Cameraman, from which we heard excerpts earlier. B-24 Squaw, flown by Lieutenant Royden Lebrecht, was not critically hit, and could have likely made it back to Libya, but instead opted to fly to the emergency landing strip at Cyprus as she escorted the straggling group of bombers. In this group of stragglers that flew below Squaw were the Sandman, flown by Robert Sternfels, and Hail Columbia, commanded by Colonel John Kane, who received the Medal of Honor. Upon landing in Cyprus, according to reports, Hail Columbia was so severely damaged that she crashed during the landing. All of her crew survived, but Hail Columbia would be abandoned on Cyprus the next day. He would also receive the Medal of Honor. In total, about 24 B-24s made emergency landings at Cyprus and other locations, and at the end of the day, the total aircraft actually lost in the raid over Ploesti was 54, or 32% of the attacking force. After the infamous mission, with more than 310 crew members killed or missing in action, it was nearly impossible to track all of the casualties across the Romanian countryside. Here we can see a letter from the mother of Staff Sergeant George Pliny Allen, one of the gunners killed on board of B-24 Hell's Winch. This letter was written from a grieving mother to the President of the United States, expressing her dismay that she was denied a granite headstone for her son who was killed in action. It reads as follows: Dear Mr. President, please give this letter some consideration, as I feel positive you would wish this situation brought to your attention. My son, 19 years old, was reported missing after the Ploesti air raid in 1943, and 1 year later was declared officially dead by the War Department. At long last, we have given up listening for his footstep and decided to erect a stone in his memory in the family lot. We were advised to apply for a regulation granite headstone that carries the rank and citations and so on of the soldier, which is supplied by the War Department to all returned bodies of boys killed overseas. We sent an application to Washington, and to our surprised horror, it was rejected. Because there is no coffin to bury, the department rules that there shall be no stone. How can one collect the bones of an aviator shot down high in action over a burning city? And is he any less entitled to consideration than one who dies in a hospital? This seems to me an extremely cruel and stupid regulation, and almost a deliberate insult to the memory of a brave boy and his bereaved family. I write for many other parents who may have been as badly hurt as we have, and ask you to give this ruling some serious thought. Thank you, Mr. President. Most sincerely, Ruth Kane Allen. She was not the only grieving mother. For years, many of the casualties in Ploesti would remain MIA, as many had to be buried in common graves across Romania, or were in bombers that were totally destroyed upon impact. Today, however, thanks to volunteers and researchers, as well as DNA testing, heroes from the Ploesti mission are finally being identified and even brought home to be buried in the United States. In the past year, there have been multiple Ploesti raiders whose remains were identified and their families and loved ones finally received closure and proper burial, 80 years later. Despite these heroic sacrifices, Operation Tidal Wave would go down as one of the most disastrous missions in the history of the United States Air Force. This was, in large part, due to the failures in planning and execution.
That all went down the tubes when Colonel Keith Compton, KK Compton, turned at the wrong place. And he destroyed that whole plan. And because the other airplanes hit the target that we were supposed to hit, and hit other targets too. And they were on fire when we got there. And we thought before we arrived there, we thought by looking down, we could see where the fire was. And we thought that maybe the Germans had these smoke pots out, so that they were blowing the smoke over the target. But that ain't the way it was. It was that the other people had bombed our target, so some of the bombs were even going off. Frankly, I did not see the ground. And I was 150 or 200 feet above the ground. I didn't see it. And because it was all on fire. And I asked my bombardier, I said, when did you drop the bombs? Or how did you know when to drop it? He says, I couldn't see the ground. He says, all I did was drop it when there was fire underneath us. And he dropped them.
Many of the targeted refineries were hit, but many others were left untouched. It is estimated that briefly following the raid, oil production was reduced by 40% at Ploesti. However, most of this damage was repaired within weeks. In fact, miraculously, an Allied intelligence committee estimated that within a few months, due to the repairs that were made, oil production was actually higher than it was before the raid. This meant that the Americans' great sacrifice had indeed gained them very little. However, the stories of the great aviators that did and did not make it back home in Operation Tidal Wave should always be remembered for their courage and sacrifice. Making these videos takes countless hours of research, editing, and recording. If you want us to be able to continue to make them, click right here to help save history by joining our Patreon. If you know a living veteran of the air war, please fill out the form in the description so we might be able to tell their story. Also, a big thank you to Stories Behind the Stars, who help provide some of the research and stories for these aviators. They are always looking for volunteers to help tell the stories of World War II's heroes. Check them out at storiesbehindthestars.org. Thanks so much, and I'll see you next time.